We're at a really interesting place in our Sunday morning sermon series. We've been going through the entire Bible, and we're up to 1 Samuel. It's been really exciting so far to watch Samuel come on the scene, born to Hannah, who had struggled with infertility, and God answered her prayers, and just all kinds of great things going on. And we've been looking at how this great pivotal moment comes in the life of Israel, how they go from being ruled by judges or taken care of by judges to demanding a king. And that God didn't really want them to do that. He wanted to be their king. But of course he knew it was coming. He planned for it in advance, and he certainly had every intention of using David on down to Christ as King of Kings. And so, all of this is in the mind of God beforehand. But as we're getting into it, I'm reminded from what 1st and 2nd Samuel teach us about Saul and David, about these two options that we have. We can either be a person after man's heart or a person after God's own heart. And a lot of people know that King David was called that, a man after God's own heart. And, some people wonder why. And as I look at the contrast between the two of them, Saul was everything that people would look for. He was tall, he was big, he was handsome, he was charismatic in his personality, and yet he expressed an outward humility. At least we would probably look at Saul and say he was humble. David was not necessarily like Saul in very many ways. He was quite different, actually, and yet I think that what the Bible draws it down to is that Saul was constantly making choices to keep people happy. He was always after the heart of man. He wanted to keep people happy. He didn't want to face criticism. He wanted to do the popular thing. He was a man after man's own heart. He wasn't concerned with the heart of God. He wasn't obedient to God. He wasn't concerned with having God's approval. He was addicted to the approval of people around him. And I think all of us suffer that at times. David, on the other hand, is called a man after God's own heart, and we see David doing things in spite of the fact that people aren't real confident in what he's doing at the time. There came a moment when all of David's men wanted to kill him because of the bad situation they were in. And the Bible just says he encouraged himself in the Lord. And so David demonstrates this tremendous heart to go after God. He's a reckless worshiper. He suffers criticism. He goes through adversity on behalf of God. And I think the bottom line is that Saul lived for the approval of people. David lived for the approval of God. They both committed sins. We would size them up as David's being much more grave and Saul's being not that big of a deal. And yet, in God's eyes, it wasn't so much the act that they committed. It was their heart and it was their motive. And for Saul, he committed sin to keep people happy, even in disobedience to God. Whereas David, in his life, was seeking the heart of God. He wanted the approval of God. He wanted to be a shepherd like God and learn from God. And I just am so encouraged by David's example, and I have a desire in my own life to be like him, to do what David did, to seek the approval of God above all else, and to not worry about the approval of man. I want to be a man after God's own heart, and I hope that you want to be a man or woman after God's own heart as well. Can't wait to see what else we get into in this series. I'm really looking forward to it, and I just hope that you might even be able to join us either in one of our services or here on the internet through our podcast or at BethelBentonville.com. You can also catch messages at BrandonACox.com. I just hope to converse with you. I hope that this series is a blessing.